let's get started with our Charades app game. We're going to be using this app for 2 lessons. Let's get started with it. So as you can see, I already have it downloaded. And before you even get into the blocks, you can tell they already have some of the pieces here already working. The timer already works. So if you can click timer, you see the time goes down. You can stop the timer. You can reset the timer. We could hit timer and start it. We can also reset the entire game. So some of this is already set up for us, which is nice. Having that designer all set up is going to save a bunch of time. So Charades game is probably a game you've played with your family or friends. In this game, players have to silently act out words or phrases while a teammate tries to successfully guess what that word or phrase is. In this activity, we're going to begin to develop your very own Charades game, and you're going to work to analyze the code that has been pre-built for you, and then work to reduce any redundancies. So our main requirements here, we're going to have to be able to start the game. So the actor has to start the game by touching the word or phrase button, and the word or phrase is going to appear in the middle of the screen. When we're playing the game, the actor is going to be ready to act out the displayed word or phrase. That person has to touch the start button and begin the 30-second countdown. The actor is going to silently act out and display the word or phrase, not using any words or anything, and your teammate is going to try to correctly answer that word or phrase before the buzzer goes off. If teammates correctly guess the word or phrase before time's up, the actor is going to be able to shake the device 1 time to indicate correct answer. So that means that we're going to have to use a sensor for this one. So you got to be ready for that. Advancing a new word or phrase. The game's going to display a new word or phrase whenever there's a correct answer. Game displays a new word or phrase whenever time is up. Game will display a new word or phrase if the actor touches the skip button. And whenever the game advances to a new word, the timer is going to reset. Scoring. 1 point will be added for every correct answer. So when you shake it with the accelerometer, that will work. 1 point is deducted from the score if time runs out, or without the player correctly guessing the word or phrase and having to click skip to next word or phrase. 1 point is also deducted, like I said, for skipping. Okay. You can reset the game just by clicking the reset game button. That should reset our score back to 0. That should reset this display to nothing being listed. And it should also reset the timer back to 30 seconds. Okay. So one of the things that we have to think about when we're going through this game is with all these parts that we need to do, we need to make sure we have an event handler. So you are supposed to start thinking before you watch this video about how you would set up the event handler that may have been shown to you in your PLTW app. But I went ahead and gave this so you could see. So the first one said when word phrase button is clicked, this is what we have to do. We have to make a word or phrase appear, and it also has to start the timer. When we start the timer button clicked, we have to start the timer. That one seems easy. Reset button is going to have to reset the variable back to 30 seconds. Update the timer label, which I think is already working. We'll see. The skip button, there's a lot of things here. New word or phrase, reset the timer to 30 seconds, update the timer label, decrement your score, losing points that means, and then update that score label. When the reset game button is hit, remember we have to clear the score, update the score label, clear the timer, update the timer label, clear the word or phrase, and then make sure that the timer is not running, so it's enabled to false. And then the shaking, which is the accelerometer, new phrase needs to appear. We're going to increment the score, and then we update the score label. So those are the things that we're going to need to include in our programming. Okay, so let's get started with downloading the file if you haven't already, and start worrying about making this work. Now, one of the things we worked on in a previous lesson was looking at redundancies using for loops. With this, we're not going to use a for loop, but we're going to use a different redundancy called a procedure. So procedures are a way to take our blocks. So I'm going to go into blocks now, and you can too. It's a way of taking all these blocks and trying to make it less busy, okay, and trying to get less stuff to have to be displayed. So one of those ways we can do that is thinking about what we saw in 2.1, which were called procedures, those big purple blocks that had thousands of different lines of code. We can try to make some of those ourselves. So take a minute, you can even pause the video if you need to take a look at all our blocks of code here. Reset, start timer button, reset timer button, our timer and the clock, reset game, skip button. And you can see our initializations. What are some things you see that repeat themselves? Anything you notice at all? Well, one of the things that I know repeats itself is the reset timer. And that's what we're going to start to work with to start out with, is how we can adjust the reset timer as we work through this game. So we're going to go here. I'm going to scroll our stuff over a little bit just so it's out of the way. We're going to go here to where it says procedures, something we haven't done yet or used at all. So we're going to create a reset timer procedure by grabbing the toProcedureDo, and we're going to drop that in there. Make this a little easier to see. Scroll that over. So change this to reset timer. So lowercase reset, capital timer. Especially need to do that with the two T's next to each other. And what we're going to do is we're going to look for our code here where we see things that have repeating pieces. Okay. So what we need to look for are any of the pieces that are going to repeat and dealing with the reset timer. Okay, so let me drag this over so we can see it. Again, I asked you just a little bit ago to look at our blocks here. And actually, I'll drag this below. I'll put it below here. Try to center everything. Okay. And we're going to look for anything dealing with that reset timer that we see we can create a procedure for. So what do you see that you could use for the reset? Well, one of the things I notice that repeats itself with the reset timer is I notice that we have in the reset button the global time left to 30. We can drop that into our reset timer. We're going to take the time left label, and that one repeats itself, but we can see it here. And then we're going to do the clock enabled to false. All three of these things I'm going to put in as something that works in the reset, and these all go with the timer. So if I take that out and I drop that in here, I now have all that code that was in the reset for timer, and now I blocked it into its own individual action. So basically I created blocks that could be reused over and over and over if need be. So what I'm going to do with this is, now that I have the reset timer stuff, for now I'm just going to slide it over here. Eventually I'm going to close it and kind of hide it. But right now I'm just going to slide it over here. Now I took that out of the reset button. So what am I going to do now that I took it out of the reset button? Well, what I can do now in the reset game button is I can go over here now to procedure, and I can now pull call reset timer. So I created all this code to be shrunken down into just one little call line. So the way of using these procedures is to speed things up a little bit and then simplify it. So we know that the reset timer works well there in the reset game button. Is there anywhere else you see where we could take these three lines of code and we could plug it in to one of the other boxes, and we could get rid of all those other lines of code to make it simple? If you're looking at the reset timer button up here, you'll notice that the reset timer button looks exactly the same as this procedure. If I drag these two next to each other, you'll see they look exactly the same. So we can simplify having all these boxes by taking these out, deleting them, and now we can actually simplify just going over to procedure and using the reset timer. So all three of those blocks or all three of these lines, represent the reset timer piece. So now when we look at our coding over here, if I hide that procedure, you'll see that things are starting to get even simpler around here. It's less that we have to look at. So that's a good thing. Now when you're looking at this, I want to see if you notice anything else that we could simplify so that we could just use one line of code instead of using 2 lines or 3 lines that have multiple blocks in it. One of the other ones that I looked at is I decided to bring out a procedure, a do procedure, and I'm going to call this one score label so that you can see what I'm doing. I'll zoom in. Score label. Go ahead and change yours. Now what I want to do is I want to look for anything that deals with the score label, and the score label actually repeats itself several times. If I zoom out a little bit, okay, I see here in the reset game button, there's the score label. And that's 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks of code. Down here in the skip button, same thing. Okay. And if you look here in the clock button, I see the same thing as well. So instead of having this 4 times or 4 blocks of code 3 times, we can take this block of code, copy and paste it right into our procedure. So now that we have this procedure, I can take this line of code, delete it, go to procedure, and I'm just going to bring in the score label. Oops. And in the reset game button, I'm going to drop that score label right where all the blocks were. A lot less work. Now I can go down here to the skip button, and I can get rid of all these blocks. And again, I'm going to use the score label. This time I'm going to copy and paste. Drop that score label into the skip button. Oops. Right there. And where else can we get rid of the score label blocks? Down here in the if the timer equals 0 spot. I'm going to get rid of that. And this time I'll just pull a score label and drop it right in there. Now, this block, this procedure block, I can now go kind of hide off in the corner here. And now when we look at all that code that we had, it's starting to simplify. And we can make our blocks even closer and kind of put them a little more consistent. So this is a great way that when you know you're going to repeat stuff, use a procedure, and it gets rid of all the extra lines of code there that you don't need, that you can pull up and reuse over and over and over. It helps with the redundancy to be narrowed down. So now I'm going to ask, do you see anything else that kind of could be simplified? Anything else you see repeating? I see 1, 2. I see 2 other lines that we could simplify right now, and that's this get global score -1. So on the skip button, we lose a point if we have to use the skip button. And when the clock equals 0, we lose a point. So we can actually pull this line out and we can turn that into a procedure. So this is going to cause us to actually create 2 procedures. I'll show you what I mean. So what is it called when we lose points? It's called decrement. D-E-C-R-E-M-E-N-T, capital S for score. I'll label it decrement score. Now I can take this line of code that we see copies itself a couple times. We'll put that into the procedure. So now we can get rid of this line. We can go up here into procedures, and we can pull decrement score and put that into the skip button. That makes things a lot quicker. We can also go over here to the clock, get rid of that line, and again, pull out a decrement score and put it right there where that whole line of code was. The 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks that we had to program. Now it only really had to be done once down here in the procedure, and now it looks good in the clock sitting there with no issues. So now that we have the decrement score there, we have the score label there, let's think real quick. If we're creating a block for taking away points, is there another way that we could have in the game dealing with points that may be opposite of that? And you're probably saying, yeah, we can make one that we increment the score. So we don't have anything on the board right now about incrementing, but we do know from our event handler that we are going to have a point where we're going to have to increment the score, and it may end up in several different places. As some of you are starting to learn how to add things and do different things to your app, we can definitely have different spots where we're going to have to increment the score. So, increment score. Let's go ahead and create a block for this right away, and then we know we can go hide it off on the side with the other procedures, and we can just pull out the procedure when we need it. So the first thing we'll have to do is go to variables, and we're going to have to set a globalization. We're going to set a global score, and instead of subtracting, we're going to use an adding block. So we're going to get our initial globalization of score, and we know that the score right now is 0, but we know every time someone gets it right, the math logic is going to go up by 1. So I'm going to drop a 1 in there. So now we have our decrement and our increment procedure, and now we know whenever we're dealing with our code where we have to put an adding or subtracting of a score, we don't have to go and create it all. It's already been created by us in our procedure, and we can hide that off to the side so no one has to worry about it. So looking at our blocks now, we've made things a lot simpler by having our code really simplified through the lines and making things really a lot more simpler to follow. So, checking through my list here, we've updated the behavior to have our emulator show where all our resets are. Reset we changed to score label, and reset timer, we made those procedures there. Our skip button now has a decrement score label and score label as procedures. Reset button has been simplified all the way down to just one line. And in the clock, it looks like 3 of them, but we just did score label and decrement score. And actually, we already started thinking about how we're going to have increment score. So that's pretty good. I'm excited about that piece. Now, to end the video, before we go into the next lesson, either whenever you get to it, I want you to think about 2 things. One, you're going to have a conclusion question. The conclusion question talks about what are the benefits of creating these procedures. So in your notebook, talk about why you see it as a benefit for creating these procedures or what we talked about in the video. And the other thing I want you to think about is in charades, like we said, you're going to have different words or phrases that you have to act out in a game. So what I want you to think about today, and in your notebook, create a list of, let's start with 10 items. Think of 10 different things that you would want to add as your challenges in your charade app. So think of words or phrases that you think would be fun to act out. Think of words or phrases that may include popular movies, popular TV shows, songs, famous people, like real people, not TikTok people, or any actions that you may have to do. And make sure that those words or phrases are simple and they're appropriate, not offensive or insensitive to anyone else. And just write that list in your notebook, and you're going to need that for the next time we come back together in a video. So there you go. You got your conclusion pieces. Make sure your app looks like mine. Make sure you have all your procedures set up properly. And if you need to go back and see what we created with these, pause the video, rewind, and make sure you see how we created those so that yours can look exactly like mine here at the end of the video before we move on to the next activity. That's it. We'll see you next time we do a video.